Okay, picture this. You are standing in the middle of a hospital ward. Or maybe you're sitting at your desk at 2:00 a.m. with a massive microbiology textbook open in front of you, fueled by nothing but caffeine and panic.
Yeah, I've been there.
And you're staring at a word that comes up constantly. Staphylococci.
It is arguably the most important genus of bacteria you will encounter in clinical practice. I mean, it's everywhere.
And that is exactly why we are doing this. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today is a special edition we're calling our last-minute lecture series.
A cram session.
Exactly. If you have an exam tomorrow, or if you're about to start rounds and realize you've completely forgotten the difference between a frinkle and a carbuncle, we have your back.
We certainly do. And just to be clear about our ground rules, we aren't just going to read the textbook to you. We are looking exclusively at the 4th edition of Lippincott Illustrated Reviews, Microbiology, Chapter 8.
And our goal is to decode the density of that text, right?
Oh, right. We want to pull out the high-yield concepts, the stuff that actually matters for patient care and, the why behind the memorization.
So what is our mission today?
Our mission is to dismantle the Staphylococci.
Yeah.
We need to understand why this bacteria can be a harmless hitchhiker on your skin 1 minute and a lethal killer causing toxic shock the next. We're going to look at its structure, its weapons, and how it survives everything we throw at it.
Let's start with the big picture then. When we talk about gram-positive cocci, we are usually splitting them into two massive families, staph and strep.
That's the first branch in the decision tree.
So how do we tell them apart immediately?
So imagine you're in the lab, you've got your sample. Under the microscope, they both look like round purple balls. That's the gram-positive cocci part. But the arrangement is your first clue.
Right, the text says Staphylococci look like bunches of grapes.
Exactly. The name actually comes from the Greek staphyl, meaning a bunch of grapes. It's a very distinct visual. Streptococci, which we'll cover another time, usually form chains.
But the real clincher isn't just the shape, it's the chemistry.
It's the catalase test. Absolutely fundamental.
Walk me through that. This is the Buttle test, right?
It's very simple and incredibly high yield. You take a colony of the bacteria and drop a little hydrogen peroxide on it.
And if it bubbles?
It's staph, just like putting peroxide on a cut.
Oh, okay. Same reaction.
Exactly the same chemical reaction. Staphylococci produce an enzyme called catalase, which breaks down the peroxide into water and oxygen gas. And those are the bubbles. Streptococci generally don't do that.
So bubbles means staph. No bubbles means strep. That is your first fork in the road.
Got it.
Okay, so we have a cluster of grapes that bubbles. We know it's staph. But the source material makes a big point about how resilient these things are.
Oh, they're incredibly tough. And this is a key takeaway for infection control. Staph are facultative anaerobes, so they can live with or without oxygen. But more importantly, they are incredibly resistant to heat and drying out.
Which brings us to the concept of fomites.
Right.
I feel like this is a word that only exists in medicine and maybe Scrabble.
It essentially means any inanimate object that can carry infection. A doorknob, a bed rail, a stethoscope. Because staph resists drying, it can survive on these surfaces for a long time.
And then you touch it, touch your face.
Transmission complete. That's why hand washing is everything.
Okay, so it's a tough bug. But not all staph are created equal. There is one specific bad guy in this chapter that seems to get 90% of the attention.
Staphylococcus aureus.
Wow.
Without a doubt. If the staph genus were the crime family, aureus is the godfather. The rest are just street soldiers.
And the text distinguishes the godfather from the soldiers using another test.
Yes, the coagulase test. This is probably the most critical differentiation in the chapter. S. aureus produces an enzyme called coagulase.
And that does what?
It clots plasma. The other species, like S. epidermidis, don't do this. They're coagulase-negative.
So let's recap the flow. If it bubbles with peroxide, it's staph.
Yep.
If it then clots plasma, it's S. aureus.
You got it. And there's a visual cue on the plate, too. Aureus means golden in Latin.
Oh, right. The color.
On a culture plate, S. aureus often has this golden yellow pigment. The other, less aggressive staph species usually look gray or white. Also, S. aureus is usually beta-hemolytic. It breaks down red blood cells, creating a clear zone around the colony.
Okay, so we've identified our target. Staphylococcus aureus. Golden, coagulase positive, resilient. Now we need to understand how it hurts us. The text breaks this down into an arsenal.
It's fully loaded. And Lippincott organizes this really well into two categories. Structural defenses, think of that as the armor, and then the toxins, which is the artillery.
Let's start with the armor.
Yeah.
What keeps our immune system from just eating these things immediately?
First, there's a capsule. It's a polysaccharide layer that makes the bacteria slippery, so it prevents phagocytosis.
Phagocytosis being our white blood cells engulfing the bacteria.
Exactly. But the real star of the show, the one that you absolutely need to remember for exams, is protein A.
I saw the diagram for this. It looks like it's interacting with antibodies, but in a weird way. It's almost backward.
It is backward. Literally, it's incredibly devious. Normally, your antibodies, specifically IG work like handcuffs, they grab the bacteria with their variable region, leaving the tail end, the FPC region, sticking out.
And that tail acts like a handle for the immune cells to grab onto.
Precisely. That's called opsonization.
Mm.
But protein A binds to the FPC region. It binds to the handle.
So it's holding the antibody backwards.
Yes. Imagine a police officer trying to handcuff a suspect, but the suspect grabs the handcuffs and puts them on the officer instead. The bacteria coats itself in your own antibodies, but they are facing the wrong way.
So the immune cells just see the self part of the antibody and move on.
They assume everything is fine. It's sophisticated camouflage.
Okay, so that's the defense. What about the offense? The toxins?
This is where S. aureus gets scary. It has toxins that can damage membranes, called cytolytic toxins, like alpha toxin, which literally punches holes in cells. But I want to focus on one called PVL, Panton-Valentine, leukocidin.
That sounds like a law firm.
A very deadly law firm. PVL is a pore-forming toxin that specifically targets and kills leukocytes, your white blood cells. The text makes a strong correlation here. PVL is heavily associated with severe necrotic skin infections and severe pneumonia.
Necrotic meaning it actually kills the tissue.
It dissolves it.
Yeah.
And this is often seen in community-acquired MRSA. So if you have a young, healthy patient who comes in with a nasty skin abscess or a rapidly worsening lung infection, you have to think about PVL.
Okay, so PVL destroys cells, but then there's this other category of toxins.
Yeah.
The nuclear option, the superantigens. What makes them super?
This is a fascinating mechanism. So normally when your immune system detects a threat, it's a very targeted response. An antigen activates a tiny fraction of your T cells, maybe 0.01%.
Precise. Targeted.
Right. Superantigens break all the rules. They bind to the T cell receptors and the MHC class II molecules on your immune cells non-specifically. They just force them together.
So instead of a targeted strike, it triggers everyone.
It triggers a riot. It activates up to 20% of your T cells at once. This causes a massive release of signaling molecules called cytokines IL-2, TNF-alpha.
A cytokine storm.
That's the one. And that storm is what causes shock. The body basically attacks itself.
And this mechanism leads us directly into the diseases. Section 3 covers clinical manifestations. The text seems to group these into localized stuff, deep stuff, and toxin stuff.
Yep. Let's start with the skin, since that's what most people associate with staph.
Right. Staph is the king of skin infections.
It starts small. You have folliculitis, which is just an infected hair follicle, a pimple, basically. If that gets deeper and more painful, it's a furuncle or a boil.
And if you have a bunch of boils that connect underneath the skin.
That's a carbuncle. It's a deep, multiloculated infection. It's serious and painful. And in children, we often see impetigo.
That's that crusty, honey-colored lesion, right?
Exactly, usually around the nose and mouth.
Wow.
Highly contagious.
Okay, so that's on the surface. But if S. aureus gets into the blood, it can go anywhere. What are the high-yield systemic infections we need to know?
There are a few big ones. First, osteomyelitis. S. aureus is the #1 cause of acute bone marrow infection. If a patient has fever and bone pain, staph is your prime suspect.
What about joints?
Septic arthritis. This is a medical emergency, especially in kids. The bacteria replicate in the joint space, and the pus and inflammation can destroy the cartilage in days.
Wow.
You have to drain that joint immediately.
And the text also mentions the heart.
Acute endocarditis. Infection of the heart valves. Now, pay attention to the demographic here. The text specifically links this to intravenous drug use.
Because the needle pushes skin bacteria directly into the vein.
Exactly. And because it enters through the veins, it hits the right side of the heart first, so you often see damage to the tricuspid valve.
That's a classic board exam association.
It is. 5V drug user plus new heart murmur equals tricuspid endocarditis via S. aureus.
And finally, the lungs.
Pneumonia. But not just any pneumonia. Staph pneumonia is severe, and necrotizing it kills lung tissue. And there's a classic clinical setup. It often follows a viral infection, like the flu.
Oh, a super infection.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Patient has influenza, they start to recover, and then suddenly they crash with a high fever and difficulty breathing. That is classic staph.
Okay, so those are infections where the bacteria are physically present, but there's this other category Toxinosis.
Mhm.
This is where the bacteria might not even be in the blood, right?
Correct. This is pure chemical warfare. The bacteria produces a toxin, the toxin circulates, and that causes the disease. The most famous one is toxic shock syndrome, or TSS.
The one historically linked to tampons.
In the 1980s, yes. Hyperabsorbent tampons provided the perfect environment for S. aureus to grow and release a superantigen called TSST1. It enters the blood and causes that cytokine storm we talked about.
So fever, hypotension.
Dangerously low blood pressure, multi-organ failure, and a specific sign on the skin, a diffuse rash that looks like a sunburn. And crucially, a week or two later, the skin desquamates, it peels off, especially on the palms and soles.
That sounds terrifying. But there's another toxin disease that's probably much more common. Food poisoning.
Right, staphylococcal food poisoning. And this is a classic intoxication, not an infection. The bacteria are growing in the food, not inside you.
So potato salad at a picnic.
Potato salad, ham, egg salad, anything rich in protein and salt that's been left at room temperature, the bacteria grow and produce enterotoxins. You eat the food, you eat the toxin.
How fast does it hit you?
Fast, within like 4 to 6 hours, because the toxin is preformed.
So no incubation time.
None. It hits the vomiting center in the brain, and you get violent vomiting and cramping.
And antibiotics do nothing.
Totally useless, and this is a key point. Antibiotics kill bacteria. They don't neutralize toxins. You aren't fighting a bug. You're just waiting for the toxin to clear your system. It usually resolves on its own in a day.
Okay, one last toxin disease mentioned, and it affects babies. Scalded skin syndrome.
This is caused by exfoliatin toxin. It's fascinatingly specific. This toxin acts like a pair of molecular scissors. It cuts a specific protein called desmoglein 1.
And desmoglein is the glue holding skin cells together, right?
Exactly. It holds the cells of the epidermis together, so when the toxin cuts it, the top layer of the epidermis just slides off.
So they get blisters.
Huge blisters, or bullae, and the skin peels away looking like a severe burn. It's frightening to see, but because the basal layer of the skin is intact, it usually heals without scarring.
It's amazing that a bacteria can produce something so precise. Okay, we know what it looks like, we know how it works. Now we have to talk about the elephant in the room. Diagnosis and resistance.
This is the defining struggle of modern microbiology, but let's start with diagnosis. We remember the chemical test, but there's a specific growth medium mentioned in the text, mannitol salt agar, or MSA.
This is the plate that changes color.
Right. MSA contains a high concentration of salt, which inhibits most other bacteria. Staph loves salt, remember, it lives on salty skin. But here's the trick. S. aureus can ferment a sugar called mannitol.
And fermentation produces acid.
Correct. And the agar has a pH indicator. So when the acid is produced, the plate turns from pink to bright yellow. The other staph species usually can't do that, so the agar stays pink.
Yellow halo on MSA equals S. aureus.
Got it.
Okay, now let's talk resistance. We can't use simple penicillin anymore. Why?
Because S. aureus learned how to fight back decades ago. Almost all strains now produce penicillinase, also known as beta-lactamase.
The enzyme that breaks the drug?
It breaks the beta-lactam ring of penicillin. It destroys the drug before it can work.
So we invented new drugs. Methicillin, oxacillin. These were designed to resist that enzyme.
They were bulky, so the enzyme couldn't fit around them. And they worked for a while. But then the bacteria evolved again.
This is where MRSA comes from.
Exactly. Methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. They didn't just attack the drug this time, they changed the lock so the key wouldn't fit.
Okay, can we get technical on that mechanism? The text mentions a gene called MECA.
This is definitely exam material. The MECA gene encodes a new type of penicillin-binding protein called PBP2A.
And penicillin-binding proteins are what the bacteria use to build their cell walls.
Correct. Normally, beta-lactam antibiotics bind to these proteins and stop the wall from being built. It's like jamming gum in the keyhole.
But not with PBP2A.
PBP2A is shaped differently. Methicillin literally cannot bind to it. It has a very low affinity. So the bacteria just keeps building its cell wall, completely ignoring the antibiotic.
That is disturbingly smart. It just swapped out the hardware. The text also draws a line between hospital-acquired and community-acquired MRSA.
It does. The lines are blurring, but generally hospital-acquired MRSA is multi-drug resistant. It happens in older patients, people with catheters. Community-acquired MRSA, or CA-MRSA, hits healthy people.
The locker room outbreaks.
Exactly. Athletes, military recruits. And remember, CA-MRSA often carries that PVL toxin we mentioned, so it causes those nasty skin abscesses. Interestingly, the CA-MRSA strains are often susceptible to non-beta-lactam antibiotics like clindamycin.
But for the hospital stuff, if the beta-lactams don't work, what's our big gun?
Vancomycin. It's the standard for MRSA. But ominously, the text notes that we are already seeing VRSA vancomycin-resistant strains.
We're running out of options.
We are.
Okay, before we wrap up, we have to give a little time to the other Staphylococci, the coagulase-negative one.
Right. They are less virulent, but they are opportunistic. You need to know two of them. First, Staphylococcus epidermidis.
It's part of our normal flora, right? It lives on everyone's skin.
It does, and usually it's harmless, but it loves plastic. If you put a foreign body into a patient, a heart valve, a hip replacement, an IV catheter S epidermidis will attach to it.
And it doesn't just sit there.
No, it produces a slime layer or a biofilm. This slime coats the bacteria and sticks them to the plastic. It acts like a shield against antibiotics and immune cells. It is incredibly difficult to treat an infection on a prosthetic device.
You just had to take the device out.
Often, yes.
A nightmare. And the second one? Staphylococcus saprophyticus.
This has a very specific niche. It is a leading cause of urinary tract infections, but specifically in young, sexually active women.
So if you have a young woman with a UTI, and it's not E. coli, it's probably this.
Good chance. It's the second most common cause of cystitis in this demographic, and there is a lab test to distinguish these two, the novobiosyn test.
I always struggle keeping these straight.
Think of it this way. S. epidermidis is sensitive to novobiosyn. It dies. S. saprophyticus is resistant.
The mnemonic I saw in the notes was saprophyticus is rarely sensitive.
Or just epidermidis, sensitive. Saprophyticus, resistant. Whatever sticks in your brain at 2 a.m. is the right answer.
And really quickly, the text threw in a new species, S. argentalis.
Yeah, this is the new kid. It's fascinating because it looks almost exactly like S. aureus. It's coagulase positive, but it lacks the gene for the golden pigment, so it's colorless.
But it causes similar diseases.
It does. Just keep it in your back pocket in case you see a colorless aureus mentioned on a tricky question.
All right, we have covered a massive amount of ground. Let's bring it all back together. What are the absolute key takeaways? The cheat sheet.
Okay, here it is. Number 1. Staphylococcus aureus is coagulase positive, forms gold colonies, and ferments mannitol on MSA plates. Those three things, it's aureus.
Okay.
Number 2, its virulence is a mix of armor, like protein A, which hides it from antibodies by flipping them backward, and artillery, like superantigens that cause toxic shock.
The T-cell riot.
The T-cell riot. Number 3, MRSA is resistant because it has the MECA gene, which changes the binding site to PBP2A. It changes the locks.
And the little guys.
Number 4, don't forget them. S. epidermidis loves plastic and makes biofilms. S. saprophyticus causes UTIs in young women and resists novobiosyn.
That's a solid summary. You know, when you step back and look at this chapter, S. aureus really feels like the perfect pathogen.
It really does. I mean, think about its versatility. It can sit on a dry doorknob for days waiting for you. It can slip past your defenses with a capsule. It can trick your antibodies. It can punch holes in your cells. It can send your whole immune system into shock.
And it can poison your lunch without even having to infect you.
Exactly. It doesn't even need to be there to make you sick.
It's almost impressive in a terrifying way.
It is, and that adaptability is exactly why, despite 80 years of antibiotics, it remains one of the most formidable challenges in medicine. It's not going away.
A sobering thought to end on. For those listening, we highly recommend glancing at figure 8.12 in the text. It's a great summary chart of everything we just discussed.
It really pulls it all together. Good luck with the exam or your rounds. You're going to do great.
Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive.
Yeah.
We'll see you next time.